you, Danny and Caleb. I did remember that this was Father's Day. Not that it mattered, but I did remember. And you know, as I thought about the whole concept of Father's Day, as I think I've mentioned to you before, we praise moms and we encourage dads. And you know, I think it is a fact that not only is people who trust in God blessed, but those who they come in contact with are blessed also. There are some topics that I am wise enough now, after nearly however many years of doing this, a lot, that I know I probably need to stay away from. And one of those is attempting to talk very much about my own father. I can't do it, and never have. In fact, years ago, Lisa took my dad's old 8mm. You remember 8mm movies with that camera that was 12 feet long and you hung it on your shoulder and you went around and shot those little things of film? My dad had one of those and put together all kinds of films for years. And one year as a present, Lisa went and took all of those and turned them into videotapes for me. And it was one of the nicest, sweetest gifts that she's ever given me. And it took me years before I watched them. It is painful for me to remember what I've lost when I think about my parents. And even though it wasn't the case, I don't know how Dad was when he died, but I guess he was about the same age as I am now. It seems like it was forever ago. And when I think about what he meant to me in my life, you know, he was, in every sense of the word, bigger than life. And so we have one of those. If you guys don't have one of these, you need one. We've got one of those electronic picture frames in our house, and it scrolls your pictures for you all the time. And my wife, the picture maven, has got, like, I don't know, 11,000 pictures on our picture frame. And so, yeah, I know. I'll tell you later.
This is true. I can testify to it.
And you know, you were there. And you know, it still warms my heart when I see pictures of my mom and dad when I was young, or even before I was. And so I think, you know, that's a good thing. It's a good thing to remember. And dads, thank you. I don't want to diminish what you do, dads or granddads whatsoever, but I decided not doing that this morning. Instead, I want us to go back to Philippians. And it was interesting, as I was prepping this, it kept coming back to Father. It kept coming back to our Father and the work of our Father. I guess that was the way it was supposed to be. Accountability in our own personal lives is kind of an interesting topic. And yes, like many of you, I suppose, accountability was one of those lessons I learned from my dad. That you take responsibility because you will be held accountable for whatever you do or don't do. And that was part of the lesson. That we expect, isn't it true that you expect accountability in almost every sector of your life? You do. You know, this morning when I got up and was working on my sermon and all that stuff that I do on Sunday morning to get ready, and then in that last hour is my time to put it all away and shower and get ready. Our power went off this morning, John. And I wasn't exactly sure who to hold accountable, but I noticed that it came on about 20 minutes after we got here. So, it is what it is, ladies. But we expect accountability. We expect it among our public servants. We expect it among those that we that we pay for service. We expect it among our teachers, our lawyers. We expect accountability among our bankers, our investment people, our doctors, and healthcare professionals. We expect it among our children, among our spouses. And so accountability, we expect accountability in every sector in our life. In the early church, Christ expected accountability among the apostles, among his disciples. The apostles expected accountability among the church, the members of the Lord's church. And we see so many examples of that in the Old Testament and in the New Testament as well. And it followed that we read Old Testament accountability and saw how God took action based upon his attempts to hold people accountable. How many times that was demonstrated. And I want us to think about what is said very briefly in the book of Philippians this morning as we continue our study there. Our text this morning is Philippians 2, verses 12 and 13. Therefore, my beloved brethren, as you've always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you both to will and to do his good pleasure. There is a phrase here, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, that has created, I would suggest, a lot of misunderstanding by people all through the years. Because who is this commandment given to? Well, it's given to believers. People who are already saved believers. And now he says, work out your own salvation. So we have to try to unscramble why that appears to be a contradiction. What this passage is reminding us of is that you and I have individual accountability. Work out your own. You don't have to work out anybody else's. And Paul is calling out the Philippians for them to do that. And so it becomes sort of an important question, how do we do it? Well, there are a number of passages, I think, that give us some insights about part of the process of working out your salvation, like in 1 John 4, believe not every spirit, but try the spirits whether they are of God. Why? Because there are false prophets out there. Paul wants them to exert themselves in their own spiritual understanding. And in part because there were false prophets. There were people who would misguide them and mislead them. Passages like 1 Thessalonians 5, quench not the spirit, despise not prophesying, but prove all things. Prove all things. Try to prove the spirits. Make sure that what you are being told is correct and is accurate. 1 Peter 3, sanctify the Lord God in your heart, but always be ready to give an answer or a defense to everyone who asks you. How are they supposed to do that? Well, Acts 17. The Bereans were considered to be more noble, more fair-minded than those in Thessalonica because they searched the Scriptures daily to see if those things were so. And so part of the accountability process for working out your own salvation is that you have a responsibility, personally, individually, to determine whether or not the things that you are hearing from me, from Tom, Caleb when he's speaking or next preaching, I mean, whatever it is. Caleb just went, what? That you have a responsibility to determine whether or not what you're hearing is true. And what the Bereans were being praised for was that they were doing that. Now, think about this relative to denominational history. We have an incredible number of denominations that exist. I'll have a lot more to say about this after our most recent trip. But I think that one thing that the trip did for me, it helped me in part to understand why they are today as confused as they are in their religion. Because they've had hundreds, thousands of years of people telling them things to confuse them. And as long as we keep listening to people, people are going to get it wrong. Selby going to get it wrong. As long as we continue to listen to people, somebody's going to tell us things that aren't accurate. And we've even had denominations who have literally told their parishioners, you should not attempt, get this, you should not attempt to read the Bible on your own. You're not capable of doing so and understanding it. Just let us tell you what it says. Yes, that happens. I know. And I can tell you that it's only been a rarely recent phenomenon that the Catholic Church particularly has instructed people that it was okay for them to read the Bible. They've now decided that, maybe we ought to let them in on something. And so, we need to be digging. We need to be digging deeply. We just finished a lengthy study on Wednesday night on angels. It's one of the more challenging topics that I've ever dug into. And one of the things I came away with was that the more I studied it, the more I understood how little I understood or knew. And maybe those are two different things. That's part of what we're supposed to be doing. And that's why any superficial acts that we have will not allow us to hold ourselves accountable by working out our own salvation. And what Paul had told them was that they were supposed to be followers of Jesus. The passage that Caleb read from the first chapter was part of a prayer. That you should approve the things that are excellent, that you may be sincere without offense till the day of Christ, be filled with the fruits of righteousness which are by Jesus Christ. Now, it's okay for you to work out our own salvation, but that still has to be founded upon our following the information that Christ has seen fit to deliver to us. We can't just go out there and make that up on our own. And that sounds so simple, doesn't it? And I will tell you in 2024, that very well could be the most profound thing that I say from a sermon. Is that we don't have the right to just go make up what we think God wants. And that's what's happening, by and large, with a whole lot of people who call themselves the same thing you call yourself, a Christian. They have maybe a little bit of Bible knowledge, maybe just enough to be dangerous, sometimes enough to know some things that it says and no clue about what the context was or what it's supposed to mean, and certainly not what the application is supposed to be, and particularly if it doesn't fit what they want. We don't have the right to make it up. We are not completely independent, even though we're supposed to work out our own salvation. We're supposed to be followers of Christ. And what I think Paul is trying to remind them of, when you are to let your conduct, you know what the word conduct means, your action, your way of life, let your way of life be worthy of the gospel, you can make your life whatever you want it to be, so long as it follows the teachings of Christ. Sorry, you thought you had total free reign. Paul just crushed that for you. And so what is important is to understand that when Paul is saying all of this, he's not saying, look, it's not from Paul. Don't pay any attention to what I say. Determine whether or not what I say is in keeping with what God says. Because when we work out our own salvation, the results of that are going to come from God. He told them in verse 13, it is God who works in you, not Paul. That what he delivered came from God. It was the mind of God. It was the purpose of God. It was the righteousness of God, that he who has begun a good work. Chapter 1, when he was talking to the Philippian brethren, he said, look, I want you to understand what all God has done to you and for you, Philippians, and to know that he has started a good work in you and he has the ability to finish it. Why? Because God is capable and God is qualified to finish it in the appropriate way. And that you and I are accountable, and we are to work out our own salvation, that we are not independent of God, but we are dependent upon God, and God will not go where we don't put him. God isn't going to go where we don't put him. You and I have to make choices. You and I have to decide if we're going to let him into our life. If we're going to let him into our work, into our school, into our family, into our interpersonal communication. That God will go where we want him to go and where we put him. And that we have to always remember that while we're working out our own salvation, we are always dependent on God and what he's going to do. And that it's not from a man of any type or person. We can't determine things without God. Paul would be saying here, it's not about me, it's not about a man. Well, what if Paul dies, the church might ask? Or what are we going to do if Peter dies, or James, the seat of wisdom? What will we do? Here's what he's reminding them. It's not about a man. It's not about another apostle. Listen, it's not even about what happens in the church. It's not about what comes from preachers. It's not what comes from elders. It's not what comes from an angel. All of those may be great sources of information. But that's not what we're going to be held accountable to in the process of working out our own salvation. It's going to be not of our own, not of our own design, not by our own standards. Those last two statements up there, I would suggest to you, are probably more hurtful than they look. That our salvation is not by our own design, it's not by our own standards. I don't know about you, but I like to be in charge. I like to decide. It's good to be the king. But we don't get to be in this context. And that's what he's reminding them of. And so he's saying, look, you work out your own salvation, but you're not alone. As we saw last week, we are together. We are to be together. We are to lock arms. We are to be steadfast together. That we are to come here into this place to inspire one another, to provoke one another. And in Ephesians, we find out that there are all these offices that are designated and roles designated in the church. So that the church being fitly together as a body, each one doing its own part. That's the way that God designed the leadership of the church to be. But why? Because in Ephesians 4:11, he said, work together in one mind. In spite of all of these various functions, be one. And that you are accountable to God. But you're accountable individually. You're not going to be accountable for your parents. You're not going to be accountable for your children, your spouse, your ex-spouse, pick somebody. The day of judgment, it's going to be you. You're going to be working out your own salvation. And Paul taught independence. Paul, when he talked about the Philippians in the first chapter, said that they were the fruit of his work. Paul obviously loved the churches that he worked with. He viewed them as being his children. And while they are viewed in Paul's mind as his children, he also said that that comes with both the joy and the heartaches. That comes with all of the effort that he has put forward to make the church function well. That there are statements that he has made to this church and to others about how much he loved them. And I think what Paul was mindful of, as we would be reminded that we started this study with, Paul knew he wasn't going to live much longer after this. Don't worry about me, essentially saying. You've received inspiration from the mind of God. Work together, share a bond, be of one mind, and remember that you're going to be accountable as an individual. And so Paul encourages them and teaches them to be independent from him. And it's an interesting thought to realize that we must be dependent on God. I read something this week that I don't think I'd ever seen and never heard. God doesn't have any grandkids. Never thought about that. God doesn't have any grandkids. Everybody is his kid. Everybody is his child. And as much as I love and adore my grandkids, they're not the same. They're not my children, they are my grandchildren, and boy are they grand. But those two sons are different. And on Father's Day, I don't need any cards, calls, texts, because no one can make me more proud than I am. Paul said these are his children, and yet they are completely independent from him and dependent upon God. And he says, I want you to follow Christ and I want you to follow God because you are his children. And follow the Spirit that he's going to give you. And that Spirit can work in you if you'll pay attention to all of the inspiration that God breathed as your Father through these writers to give you what you need to work out your own salvation. Parents, the truth is, Paul said, I commend you to God. At some point we have to do that. We have to give our kids over to God. We have to put them in his hands. There is a point at which we cannot do for them anymore as we did when they were young. And when we turn them over to God, we have attempted to prepare them for the working out of their own salvation. And we see Paul doing this with entire churches. He commended the churches of Galatia to the Lord. Acts 20, commended the church of Ephesus to God. And so here's the great lesson. Paul knew he had to turn the churches over to God. These individuals, he knew, had to be accountable to God individually to work out their own salvation. He couldn't do any more for them. And one of the hard lessons for anyone who's been a preacher for any length of time is to know that there will always be people who have sat and listened to all of the things that you've droned on about for years, who will never find themselves in a saved condition. And you got to turn them over to God. That you've done all you can do. And that's trying to make a difference. Paul told them over to God because he knew who could sustain him. Who knew who could do the best for them, what could be the best for them. He said, I commend you to God. God, they're yours. And isn't that pretty wise when you think about it? Aren't there a lot of things in our life that we'd be a lot better off if we just turned it over to God? And there are a lot of struggles that people have that's exactly what they need to do. So, in spite of all the blood, sweat, and tears, Paul left each church in the hands of God to be accountable to God and to be dependent and reliance on God. But the phrase that sometimes creates problems here is this one. So work out your own salvation and do it with fear and trembling. The phrase fear and trembling is a Hebrew expression. And in this context, it refers to being awed by God's goodness and being reverent and worshipful to Him. And so work out your own salvation and do it with fear and respect and honor and every possible aspect of your being to surrender yourself to God. That's what working out your salvation with fear and trembling should be for every Christian. And that's why they're not working out their salvation as described through the New Testament of hear, belief, confession, repentance, baptism. They're working out their own salvation, that they are trying to find a way to humble their life and give it completely to the one who is totally in control. To be worshipful of the goodness and respect of God. It's exactly what the psalmist said in Psalm 2:11. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Fear and trembling. There's the combination. And so here's the lesson for this morning. We all have individual responsibility. As much as you have always obeyed, yet God is still working in you. He is capable of doing so, and He's the one that can make it happen. Work out your own salvation. And how do we do that? We do it with fear and trembling, out of respect for Him. 2 verses from one of the most incredible letters that Paul penned. But how rich are those 2 verses? Work out your own salvation. If you're here this morning and you need some help, we're going to sing a song as a means of encouragement. If you have some need to respond publicly, we want to encourage you to do that, to invite you to do that. And if there's something that we can do privately to help you, be sure to let us know before you leave this morning. If you would, please help me now as we stand together and we sing.